Viva el Fidel, vivan los barbudos, viva Cuba libre, viva el
Hey fam, it's your boy Manny D. I'm here to do a quick intro. We are doing an interview today with Dr. Isaac Saney. We're talking about Cuba, why it matters and how to make it actionable, and we get right to it. I wish I started recording before we even talked, because Dr. Saney comes in with steam from the beginning. Just to quickly recap the comments that he made at the beginning that we didn't get on screen, he just talks about how easy it is to verify sources, and people need to be mindful of who's authoring this content. Do they work for NATO? Have they worked for NATO? And if so, it's a fairly good indicator that you shouldn't trust everything that they're saying and might want to do some due diligence and research there. So he gets into that shortly here, and I thought it was a phenomenal interview. Usually we try to keep these like 10-15 minutes, keep it tight, but like that feeling when you just like meet a friend for the first time kind of took hold, and I was just enthralled. And so this goes on for I think 90 minutes. So what I've done is I'm going to try to cut this down, and then we'll do a full unedited version so you can just see like everything he's got to say. I took a lot of value from all of it, and I'm still meditating on everything. For me, some of the highlights were we want to make everything actionable, right? So what can we do in terms of signing petitions to make it clear to the politicians that we support the Cuban people? What can we do in terms of reaching out and donating money to help the medical supplies reach Cuba, because they've been so affected by the U.S. sanctions? They do such good work in terms of sending people out, doctors to support other countries, and as Dr. Saney educated me, people who to go help with reading programs and literacy programs across Canada, across the world. They're helping so many nations, and they need help right now when it comes to medical supplies and battling COVID. And then he also talks about how we need to, like, the internet is a great place to kind of go and try to counter the propaganda of imperialism. So it is good to be involved with Twitter and these other social media hellscapes, but at the same time, try to root that in real offline action. Getting involved with various groups. It could be the Communist Party, it could be the NDP, but get involved in your community and building solidarity with comrades. I will, so as a disclaimer, I just said NDP. I feel bad about that. Maybe don't do the NDP unless it's specifically Matthew Green, Leah Gazon, or Avi Lewis. And we're looking for people who are anti-imperialist, people who are not going to cheer on war and celebrate war. I think Leah Gazon may be the strongest voice in the anti-imperialist front for the NDP. And then I should give a shout out to Paul Manley. He's done a lot of really good work. We talk a little bit about Haiti in this interview, and I think it's important to remember that the Breach was able to report that Canada helped orchestrate some of the plans that led to all the problems that are happening in Haiti. Canada was directly involved with that, and we know that because Paul Manley used his office to facilitate freedom of information requests. So even though he's the Green Party, and even though we're not fans of the Green Party, Paul Manley, anti-imperialist, good guy. So if you have to pick electoral politics to get involved in to kind of root your action, Paul Manley and Leah Gazon are probably the most anti-imperialist of elected MPs. So without further ado, let's jump to the interview with Dr. Isaac Saney, and then I'll do another video where it's the full unedited version. It was such a pleasure to talk to him, and I hope you enjoy as much as I did. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Isaac Saney here today. He's an internationally recognized and highly decorated expert, a lecturer on specialties such as the international political economy, race and racism, and perhaps most prominently, international studies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Cuba. Dr. Saney is also the co-chair of the Canadian Network on Cuba and author of the highly acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, an examination of Cuba, which continues to be the subject of focus in university courses around the world. Dr. Saney, thank you so much for making the time to be here today. I am honored and humbled to see you.
I'm very pleased to be here. I'm honored to be on your program. I really appreciate those two generous words. I think my book did make a contribution, but it's high time that I updated it, and I haven't got around to doing an update of it. But the Cuban example, continues to interest people, and for many people, inspire them across the world.
Absolutely. I think, like, just to jump right into it. So the primary goal of this program is to like make things really simple and make things actionable. Like we had Evo Morales the other day talk about how it's not just hope, but we need to talk about tasks. And that's kind of the duty of the socialist. So that's hopefully how we can kind of swing some of the lens with what we discussed today. I just wanted to quickly say too, like just looking through some of the content and some of the stuff that you've written and authored and the programs that you're involved with, it seems like you're doing so much. Is there anything like in the moment right now that's kind of top of mind for you where you wish more Canadians were and focused, either in terms of just their awareness or in terms of supporting materially?
Yeah, I just think in general, I think Canadians should be extremely aware about the volatility of international relations, regionally and of course internationally. This drive by the United States to isolate, control, if not eliminate China, whatever one thinks of the Chinese political and socioeconomic system, it's clear the United States has identified China as its chief rival, right? There was a pivot to Asia by Obama, and we see Biden basically continuing this idea of, the Chinese represent a threat, the whole racist idea of the yellow peril. There was an article in the Washington Post, op-ed by George Will, who is sort of like this commentator, a political commentator, who talked about the civilized world uniting against China. And of course, when China was seen as an extension of international capital, where people believed it was, and all this investment was going on, and China was a sweatshop of the world, where people thought it was basically an adjunct to Western capital, everybody was happy, right? And suddenly China is an independent country. Whether it's socialist or not is an important question for people to argue about. But I think what's important, it's an independent pole of economic and political power, and the US is challenging it. And Canada is being drawn into this alliance, right? Into these war-making plans and stratagems, right? There's an increasing integration of the Canadian military and Canadian foreign policy into the United States, which follows the integration of the economy. And I'm worried about the fact that Canada won't be a factor for peace unless, we, the people, realize that we have to make Canada a factor for peace by getting out of aggressive military alliances like NATO and NORAD. And so that's one thing. And also when we look in our region, I think it's important also, and we're going to talk about Cuba, but it's important what's happened in Haiti, right? And I was very surprised to discover that the fourth largest US embassy in the world is located in Haiti. So Haiti becomes this very strategic spot where because it's strategically located. There's Cuba. It can be used to observe Latin America, subdivision Latin America, Central America and South America. And so Haiti itself, the assassination of Moise, yes, he was tyrannical. He was imposed on the people, but assassinations and doing politics through murder is not beneficial to any group of people, right? And so the fact that we don't know, it's murky, whose hands were involved and so forth, the call for intervention in Haiti, and people may not realize that from 1915 to 1934, the United States occupied Haiti and so forth. And so there's that. And so when we look at what's happening in Haiti, the sanctions against Venezuela and Nicaragua, the attempt to overturn the elections in Peru, okay? Obviously we had the coup against Evo Morales, and then we had, obviously the people managed to overturn that with the election. All of these things point to a very volatile situation in our region of the world. Canada is part of the Americas, and it's part of the Organization of American States. But, we have Christian Freeland, when she was Minister of Foreign Affairs, she, basically led the creation of this group called the Lima Group, right, which is very retrogressive and so on. So I think this is a big issue. Canadians need to look at the dangers that are emerging, the volatility of international relations. And of course, the events in July 11th, right, in Cuba, we see the mainstream media, and we see the government taking a position, right, of violating Cuba's sovereignty and independence, right, and in a sense, ignoring the more than 60-year-long war that the United States has waged against Cuba, economic and subversive. And I always like to emphasize that when we look at Haiti and we look at Cuba, they're both guilty of the same crime. When the Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, and then Haiti was declared an independent country in 1804, the Western powers imposed a cordon sanitaire on Haiti. Haiti was a crime they could not forgive, right? And in a sense, they either wanted to reconquer Haiti, and if they couldn't reconquer Haiti, they wanted to reduce Haiti simply to such misery that it could never be an example to oppress people. Cuba is that same unforgiven crime, the unforgivable revolution of the 20th century. And if they can't crush Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, okay, if they can't crush it, they're going to try and make it into such make it such an outpost of misery because of their sanctions and their siege, right? That it can't be an example that it's possible to have a different set of social arrangements, right? And within this as well, it's the US policy to Cuba is also aimed against, not only destroying any semblance of independence in Latin America. And in fact, I think it's important to bear in mind that Anthony Blinken, the current US Secretary of State, declared that Latin America was in the front lines of the struggle against China. Okay, so he said that, and and many people were talking about the pink tide when Chavez, and you had Lula, and you had Evo Morales, and so forth, and Kirchner. They were worried about this pink tide because you saw sort of the resurgence of Latin American independence, at least degrees of independence, right, challenging U.S. hegemony. And Latin America and the Caribbean has always been seen as the U.S. backyard. And so if the U.S. is to engage in some sort of contestation with China, right, to become to ensure it's the global hegemon, it's the global power, it has to, a lot of people are writing, their thinkers that the US needs to control Latin America, right? And so that's one thing about eliminating independence. And Cuba is obviously the clearest example of a country in Latin America maintaining its independence. And of course, there's also attached to this idea is exercising, right? Okay, not exercising, but exorcising this idea of socialism, right? Okay, because socialism has now become a term that's no longer the pariah term, right? No longer the boogeyman term among a lot of young people in North America. And Cuba is an example of socialism. So if you can destroy socialist Cuba, if you can try and render it, shall we say, impoverished, if you can asphyxiate it, then perhaps you can discredit the concept of socialism. And in fact, Biden himself has talked about this. He's talked about, this is a battle between capitalism and communism, and I don't like socialism, and so forth. So the ideological, there's a lot of stuff bound up in what we can talk about Cuba and what we can talk about Canada. There's a lot bound up here. And I think Canadians need to really think about the political arrangements in their country, okay, and how people can be empowered, but also think about Canada being a genuine factor for peace on the world stage.
Yeah, no, there's so much to unpack there. I think just kind of try to break it down simply. Like being a union guy, I look at a lot of stuff through like the organizing principles of AEIOU, which is agitate, educate, inoculate, organize, unionize. And I think right now with the condition of the planet just literally being on fire, a lot of people right now are agitated and they know there's something wrong. They can see it quite clearly in their communities and across the world. But when it comes to like the education side, that's where we're really kind of starting to see people start to be curious about, like you said, the word socialism and what are the other alternatives. In terms of Canada, I know that we have a pretty, part of my language, but a crappy media system. Like when it comes to being educated, where is it you go to find media? Where is it that you would suggest people look for information?
Well, when it comes to Cuba, I read Cuban sites, right? I read other, I read articles that appear in different, left-wing sites like, Cuba, for example, can be very controversial in the left. There's a lot of so-called left opinions. I completely disagree with Cuba. I was very surprised that so many people on the so-called left, immediately supported imperialist intervention in Cuban imperialist lies. That's another story we can get into, right? So, I go to original sources. I read the New York Times, right? I read Washington Post and Globe because you need to know what people are thinking, right? But, there's some sites like, Counterpunch sometimes has some good articles, right? It depends, it can be uneven, right? And I go to various other left-wing websites and so on, right? Okay, that write about these particular issues. But when it's very difficult with the media, really, right? And I think people, know that, there's so many sites, right, that you can go to, right? And it takes a while to actually verify this sort of stuff. And the internet can be full of all sorts of information. So there's a lot of information and a lack of knowledge and wisdom, right? Okay, and it's very hard to go through these things. So one of the first things I do, especially when it comes to Cuba, is I go to the original websites, right? Okay, and I read Granma, I read Juventud Rebelde, Cuba Debate, and I read stuff that's posted by people like Helen Yaffe, for example, on Cuba. The U.S. normalization website on Cuba as well produces interesting stuff, as well as the Canadian network on Cuba, right? And, and of course, when it comes to anti-imperialist stance, there are various left-wing groups who produce good things. So in Canada, anywhere from CPCML to the CP to other groups produce interesting articles, right? And talk about these things and talk about empowering people and so on, right? So I hope that kind of answers your question. And then the authors, people who I know are commentators, I look to see what they've said on particular topics, right? As well, right? My first thing is obviously that, and people have this thing is if a story appears in the monopoly media, okay, I think you have to be skeptical about it. Okay, so and when it comes to Cuba, if something appears in the monopoly media, many people, even on the left, tend to believe what's in the monopoly media until it's disproven, right? And by the time it's disproven and they've come to the senses, it's too late because damage has been done, right? So I think people need to develop, as Marx has spoken about it, like doubt everything, right? A healthy, skeptical attitude to the ruling elite's propaganda.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think that's like a beautiful tactic. I wonder though, is there a specific Canadian source you might recommend, or it really does depend on the story itself and
It
what's
depends on the
trending that day?
story itself, right?
Okay.
Okay. There's sites, I look for sites that are consistently anti-imperialist, right?
Mm,
I mean, one of the key things is anti-imperialism, right? Okay. I think that's a key thing, I know people will argue, well, anti-imperialism is kind of reductionist, it's not nuanced and so on. People argue this, but, how can, I think, in our context, and context is everything. In our context today, to defend the sovereignty, independence, and right of self-determination of countries of the global south is inherently revolutionary.
mm,
Okay? It's
absolutely.
those people's rights to work out their own political arrangements, however dissatisfied we might be with them, right? There's a tendency on the West to say, I support your right to self-determination only so long as you self-determine in a way I tell you to self-determine. Well, that's not solidarity, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So and there's some sites that are quite anti-imperialist, right? Okay. I think that CPCML strike is anti-imperialist. The CP is anti-imperialist. I'm not promoting the CP. I'm not saying that, right? I'm just saying there are articles that occasionally appear there. Occasionally there are articles that have appeared in the bulletin that are anti-imperialist, and sometimes they're very bad articles that appear, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's all of these things, and I think people need to think these things through clearly themselves, right? Okay.
Absolutely.
I think the first thing is you have various authors you can talk about, okay, and so on, right? But I think there's some people who are clearly anti-imperialist, and I think that's an important step as well, right? To basically say, when someone is, because there's this idea of humanitarian intervention, and the idea of humanitarian intervention is obviously, the ultimate goal is to destroy these countries' independence. It's also to intervene, right? And it's also, on face value, an idea that independence, sovereignty, and self-determination, really are not inviolable principles, right? They're some things that can be tossed aside. But that when those rights are violated, that's when you have the worst crimes committed against the peoples of the world.
What do you see the current state of Cuba being? And if you can, maybe putting a Canadian lens on it, because I know some people are saying there's the Trudeau's family historically has some affection for Cuba. And so there's a thought that Canada has more solidarity. And I think that's true in terms of relative to the United States. But I don't think that we're quite the ally some people seem to expect us to be.
Yeah, so there's Canada and Cuba have had relations, uninterrupted relations for over 75 years, right? Uninterrupted relations. When they had it, and when the United States and in the wake of the early years of the revolution and put pressure on other countries in the Americas to break relations with Cuba, only two countries didn't. Mexico and Canada, right? And so, and that was an idea of Canada asserting its independence in one ways. But it's important to understand that the Canadian embassy also served as a place of subterfuge in Cuba, right? Okay. For all sorts of spying took place there as well, right? Okay. And so the Canadians Canada played a particular role as well, right? So there used to be this theory in academia, in poli-sci, Canada has soft power and Canada is a middle power and so on, right? And therefore Canada, and Trudeau spoke about a track between Moscow and between Washington, right? While at the same time, he was really cooperating with Washington at various points in time, right? So I think, yes, there are personal relationships, and Fidel Castro had a personal relationship with Trudeau and with his family and so forth, right? There's a famous saying in Latin America, so far from God, but so close to the United States. Okay. And this whole argument is that, Canada also sleeps next to the elephant, right? And, Trudeau spoke about that, right? And in the 60s and the 70s, there was a movement where Canadians began to recognize that there was a lot of penetration of US capital into Canada. Canada was becoming an adjunct, right? And so there were many people who, there was this debate in the 60s and 70s about, that the struggle was equally against the Canadian ruling class as against US imperialist domination of Canada. And there was that feeling that, in a sense, Canada had to deal with this overweening power of the United States that was taking it over economically and then began to control it culturally and so forth, right? That's why we had all this CanCon stuff brought in to try and, in a sense, defend Canadian culture, as imperfect as that was and limited as that was, and perhaps did for different reasons than we actually thought it was. Cuba, therefore, there was this affinity to Cuba, this island nation that was struggling to free itself of US domination, right? Okay. At one point, Cuba was simply an appendage of the US economy. It was a neo-colony, right? And if the United States caught a cold, Cuba caught pneumonia. It was so tied into the United States, right? And then Cuba broke that, and not only broke that, but broke the mafia connections into Cuba as well. So there was this affinity. And then so Canadians naturally, expressed solidarity with Cuba. There were committees set up in the 1960s and so forth, and, fair play for Cuba committees, but then there were the friendship associations that emerged later on. And then, of course, in the 1990s, when Cuba had to go into tourism because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? The Cuban economy, it's one of the greatest, if not the greatest decline of the economy in peacetime. From 1989 to 1994, middle of 1994, the Cuban economy declined by 35%. Can you imagine Canadians dealing with 0% growth? I mean, there'd be chaos here, right? Yeah. 35% growth. And so Cuba, in order to earn foreign exchange, and the US had tightened the economic sanctions, its economic war against Cuba at that time, Cuba turned to tourism. And we know that close to 1 million Canadians visit Cuba every year, right? Okay, and some of them are repeat visitors, right? Okay, and when you see Cuban reality for itself, as Fidel Castro says, Cuba is neither heaven nor hell. Okay, but when you see Cuban reality for itself, right? Okay, Canadians come away with a profound respect. And so when it comes to Canadian policy, I think the government realizes there's this profound respect for Cuba among Canadians, which acts as sort of a brake against Canada, perhaps deciding it's going to follow a US policy in regards to Cuba. More importantly, by having this policy towards Cuba, it also, so we have a certain, no, we're not really going lock in step with the United States. We have an independence from the United States and so forth, right? And they can maintain that kind of pretense, such as the pretense that Canada is a peacekeeper, right? People, I think that's been shattered in the last few years. People are doing very good work on that. So I think that's one of the reasons why, in terms of what's going on, I think that even, for example, when we had the Havana syndrome emerge in the US, these ideas that US diplomats were under attack and the mysterious weapons that many scientists have debunked, Canadian diplomats said they had the same symptoms, right? Okay, and then Canada left, and then it reduced its visa, right? Its services in the Canadian embassy. And there was a backlash from Canadians over that, right? And I think the government took notice of that, realizing it has to tread very carefully on its relations with Cuba, precisely because of the deep sympathy and affinity that Canadians have, right? And it's not just a love of the Cuban people, it's a respect for the fact that this nation has been able to resist the United States for over 60 years and maintain its independence, resist the empire, right? And so I think those are one of the important things. And I think, for example, we have from the Canadian Network in Cuba, a petition we launched on May the 28th, if I remember correctly, of this year, a petition against US economic blockade against Cuba and for preserving Canada-Cuba relations on the basis of a basis of mutual respect and equality. We've got nearly 3,000 people have already signed it, right? Okay, and we had a big uptick after the events of July the 11th. There was a big uptick despite the massive propaganda against Cuba. So, we have 2 million syringes going to Cuba from Canada, right, from the Canadian Network in Cuba, that hopefully will be arriving in the next few days. We have medical supplies that are going, right? Okay, so I think what's happened is that, in a sense, the real support for Cuba comes from the Canadian people, right? And the Canadian government has to be very sensitive of this, right? That doesn't mean they won't at some point make a decision that the hell with public opinion, the hell what the people think, because this is obviously, a government of the elite, that they won't decide that in order to be lockstep with the United States, to join the US empire, they may have to join this attack on Cuba. But I think they have to tread very carefully.
Mm-hmm. I wonder then, just with, we've seen Latin America, uprisings of people coming together and demanding more from their governments, demanding socialist governments. And as this uprising continues, it almost seems as though this is an opportunity for capitalists to hit back. And I wonder, do you feel like there's a heightened risk that Canada would join such an attack against Cuba?
Well, yeah, I think there's a whole debate on the left, right? Okay. So the idea is you listen to these things and capitalism is in crisis, right? There's the ecological crisis. There's the pandemic they can't control. Even as the United States says the pandemic is under control, as Biden says this stuff, the July the 4th was a victory. We see this resurgence of the Delta variant, right? We see unemployment. We see insecurity, right? We see all of this sort of stuff, right? And we see volatility on the world stage, right? And all of these different things, right? So some people say, well, capitalism is on its last stages, right? Okay, and that revolution is now going to be in flow. I mean, the point is, it may be like that, but there's no guarantee that these things will turn out in the favor of the people, right? There has to be a level of consciousness and a level of organization, right? And as we can see in the vicious sanctions against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, and the more than 60-year war against Cuba, and what's happened in Haiti, they can be pretty vicious in how they attack people, right? I mean, look at in the United States. So one of the things we haven't spoken about, which I think also undergirds this, plays a factor in this attack on Cuba, because Cuba represents this example of socialism. Whether people argue whether Cuba is socialist or not, as people argue on the left, I have my position on this, right? Cuba holds a position of being socialist in the imaginary of people. Mm-hmm. And when the George Floyd mass movement emerged last year, right? Okay, it was not only Black-led, but it was massive. It was multi-generational and multiracial. And people began to raise very profound demands of real radical restructuring of society, right? Redistribution of wealth, right? Okay, even the word socialism was bandied about. And so this scared the ruling class, right? I think it scared the ruling class both in the United States and in Canada, right? And then you saw the tearing down of their cultural symbols. Now, there's been a debate on the left, about this, tearing down a statue and renaming things really means nothing unless you have fundamental structural change, right? Yeah. But if you're a dialectician, you understand, yes, it means nothing in and of by itself, right? But it also has a powerful impact because the ruling class creates the world and the structure it wants to live in, right? Okay. And these are the heroes, right? It wants to have up there. These are the values it wants to extol. And so when you begin to tear down those statues, tear down those symbols, it begins to wonder, is it losing ideological hegemony, right? Mm-hmm. If it loses ideological, what people call ideational hegemony, or they lose the fact that they can dominate how people think, is this the beginning of the end, right? People get very concerned. Whether it is or not, they develop that kind of perception, right? I mean, it's like, if anyone's watched Judas and the Black Messiah, right? Okay, about Fred Hampton, whether the Black Panther represented, or Black Power represented a real threat to the United States or not, we can debate that materially, but the ruling class believed that, right? Edgar Hoover believed that. That's why they poured so much into COINTELPRO. So this idea of them hitting back viciously, I think is quite apt. They're in a life and death struggle. They want to destroy the vestiges of socialism. They want to demonstrate that there's no alternative to the system we have. They want to, privatize everything. They want to go back to the 19th century where there were no rights whatsoever. I mean, I'm lucky enough to teach at university, right? And I'm going to be celebrating 30 years teaching at my university on September the 1st, right? Okay. So I'm thinking there, and and I listen to people talking about the average person is going to have to retrain 4 and 5 times in their lives. Yeah. Who can retrain 4 and 5 times in your life, right? Okay. So the idea is now insecure, and then it becomes exciting. Yes, you'll be doing different things and you'll be excited. Well, they're making a virtue of economic insecurity. Yeah. So I think you're quite right. I try not to, people try to predict all sorts of stuff. I mean, what I can say, obviously, with some certainty, is the system we live in will not solve our problems, right? Okay. Whether capitalism is on its last legs or not, it's obviously a moribund system that cannot solve our problems. And those who rule it have lost all sense of decency, okay, all sense of commitment to humanity, okay, and are willing to strike back. So in the wake of the George Floyd stuff, look what's happening to voting rights in the United States. Yeah. People are fleeing places like Texas, right? It's so outright white supremacist and racist what they're doing, and yet they're proceeding with that, right? And the ecological crisis in which, which has engulfed all of us, they can't solve that problem and they're ignoring it. And we have Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, and who was the other one, flying off into space, right? In this ridiculous space race, right? I mean, it's absolutely insane. And yet it's like, it's sometimes, I read a lot of science fiction. It's like I'm reading a very bad, science fiction potboiler, right?
Yeah,
okay? Watching a very bad science fiction movie, right? These guys have completely taken, we can say they've completely taken leave of reality, but it's not that. They're the ruling class, right? They believe they have all the power and they have the divine right to rule us, right? There were articles appearing in some of the press, right, when these voting rights were being restricted, right? That perhaps I think it was in the New Republic. I think it was in the New Republic, and I may be wrong, but there was an article that talked about specifically, well, yes, less voters is better.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Returning to the ideas of the so-called founding fathers, an archaic document from the 18th century that's supposed to govern us in the 21st century, where they wanted to limit the franchise. because they didn't want to have mob rule. The people, the hoi polloi, right? And so people want to return to that kind of limited claims on citizenship and so forth. So I'm not really answering your question, but I think, these people can hit back. The United States has the preponderance of military. I mean, the US spends more on its military budget than the next 10 to 12 different countries, right? Okay, the Pentagon and the US military is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the largest consumer of fossil fuels, right? They have over 800 bases across the world. They're ready to wage war, and we haven't even taken into consideration the private armies that are now operating almost as loose cannons and doing their own thing. We haven't taken into consideration all the subversive operations that are run by the CIA and other intelligence operations, right? So I think they can do a lot of damage, right? And the whole idea in the when Marx and others used to speak about what I know, and I think it was Luxembourg, socialism or barbarism. There's no guarantee that if capitalism collapses and fails, that we will have the kind of system we want. People need to be conscious and organized, right? And we need to fight back against the atomization of human beings that we see unfolding. Like social media, for example. A lot of the fights take place on social media, but social media is so atomizing, right? Okay. In many ways. I know there's a lot of intellectual stuff, a lot of interesting arguments that take place, a lot of people who don't know anything, who feel that because they've done research on Google, they're now experts on all this sort of stuff, but also it's very atomizing, right? Okay, because at the end of the day, it's flesh and blood people in their concrete, in their real social relations, interacting together, who will change the world.
Mm-hmm. There's so much to unpack. I don't even know where to start. I think just to go from your last statement, I wonder, because we see so much of that frustration, that anger being kind of siloed online, and people will vent and they'll feel like they've accomplished something because they got 20 likes or they went viral. But it's all being siloed in this digital narrative that doesn't really seem to affect anything broader. And I wonder, do you see value in engaging that space, or should we focus more towards offline actions?
Well, no, well, first of all, I think, there's a neoliberalization of the resistance to oppression and exploitation, because it's all individual and privatized. I speak from my personal space, right? Very few, I find very few people talk about collective struggle, right? And collective actions, right? That's one thing. But the social media and internet exist, right? And I think it's an arena of struggle. We can't abandon it, right? Social media is important because the ruling class and the imperialists will use it against people. So in the case of Cuba, when these July events broke out, then, and the context for these events, obviously, is the fact that, the pandemic, has decimated tourism for Cuba. Okay. And of course, under Donald Trump, he deepened in ways people didn't think it could be deepened, this economic sanctions against Cuba, this economic war. Over 243 distinct measures, 50 of them implemented in the pandemic itself, right? So the idea is to asphyxiate Cuba. And the whole point about this was, it goes back to Lester Mallory, who was a Assistant Secretary of State, a memo he wrote in April 6th. He was an architect against Cuba, who said, in order to alienate government support, we have to starve the island, basically, right? Great hunger and desperation, so people overthrow the government. So what happened is you have these conditions in Cuba, shortages and frustrations. And of course, any government can make errors and mistakes, can be imperfect and administers that stuff. So there are inefficiencies, right? Because, Cuba had was embarking on a program of updating its economic model, right? Some people refer to as reforms, making the economy more efficient, trying to deal with these inefficiencies, right? Okay, and so, but with the grinding down of the economic sanctions and the shortages, there are real economic frustrations, and there are social problems in Cuba. Social problems that may be small by Latin American standards, right? But people have to deal with these issues, right? Okay, so within that, getting to social media, there's these frustrations, and the United States launched an orchestrated campaign against Cuba to take advantage of those frustrations, those legitimate frustrations, right, which people have, right? Okay, and even the government acknowledged people have a right to protest and they have a right to be frustrated. But the U.S. was taking advantage of this through a very carefully orchestrated campaign in which social media, things like Twitter, right, for example, played a very important role with these hashtags and so forth. So the imperialists will use social media. Okay, so we have to contend with them there, because there are a lot of people operating social media. It's, for example, I cannot live without email. I mean, there was a time, I'm old enough to remember before there was email, but you can't function on email or your cell phone. Okay. And some people use Facebook. So we have to struggle there, right? But I think you're right. It cannot be a substitute for real concrete interaction with human beings. Marx said human beings are the ensemble of their social relations, right? And that's, in a sense, when you look at some of the indigenous philosophies, right, of the interconnectedness of people, okay, that's critically important. Interconnecting with people, organizing concrete struggles, right? Because social media is important. It's a battle of ideas in a sense. So you have a battle of ideas. But it's a battle in the area of symbols, right? Okay, and so on, and and reflection of power relations, so to speak. But it's not going to change power relations unless we concretely organize in the ground. So I think there's a multifaceted way of doing this. We fight in social media, we fight on the internet, but we have to have concrete organization on the ground as well, right? And I think that's one of the things that's important. So that's why people feel connected on this social media stuff, as you say, through the likes and this sort of stuff. But it's very disconnecting in that sense. So it's a fake connection that exists, right? It atomizes people at the end of the day. If that's all the work you're going to do, we have to concretely organize people who are involved in bread and butter issues as well, and people who are who have and I think and who increasingly have an existential dread about the future. And we also have to be careful about that as well. Yeah. I have a young daughter. She's 3 years old, and sometimes I'm part of this world, and sometimes you dread the future. You get extremely worried, and so there's an idea of an inevitability of the apocalypse, the inevitability of Armageddon, a fatalism, a nihilistic fatalism seizes us, right? Okay, and I think we have to, by interacting with flesh and blood people, okay, by engaging in struggle, we can say no. The apocalypse isn't inevitable. Okay, we by organizing can stay the hands of the warmongers and these people who are burning the planet, right? Okay, social media is great for advertising an event. It's great for you do web, you can stream stuff on Facebook. Sometimes you engage in these arguments, but it's no substitute for concrete organizing with flesh and blood human beings.
So if social media is a tool in the tool belt, what are some other tools you wish people focused on a little bit more in developing?
Oh God, well, I just wish the left was more organized, right? Okay, in terms of being able to use Twitter, use Facebook. So the right, and even comment sections in newspapers, right? Okay, yeah. So as a historian, and newspapers are that. As a historian, when you're reading newspapers and you're in the archives, you read editorials, you read op-eds, and you read letters to the editor, right? Okay, especially letters to the editor. What are people thinking? And people who are writing like those are people who have time to write. It's selected by the editorial board, also puts a high premium on literacy and so forth, right? But when we are doing research now, and when people and hopefully, and you're looking at the articles, there are comment sections, right? And the right wing is always very well organized, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's one thing as well. The left isn't. So we need to develop, shall we say, a facility to use Twitter in very progressive ways, right? You mentioned TikTok, right? There's Instagram and so forth. So we have to develop ways of using it. There tends to be this idea that the left tends to be disorganized, disunited, right? Okay, in that way, and also there tends to be this sort of superiority attitude, right? I'm not going to deal with this kind of stuff. Twitter only operates in so many things, and so forth. You can't really express complex ideas, but we have to find ways to use the social media that way, right? I also think on social media itself, right? People attack a lot of people. We should actually think about trying to find solutions to problems, right? Okay, and try and connect our work on these various social media platforms to concrete work in the real world, right? And so on. So I know I'm talking in sort of generalities, but I think those are some of the things that would be important to do, right?
Absolutely.
And so on. I don't tweet that much, right? Okay, and I'm thinking I'm going to have to tweet because people interact with tweeting, right? Okay, yep. And how you bridge the gap from that kind of short communication that really, in some cases, superficial to a more detailed discussion is going to be very interesting, right? I mean, I think one of the problems too is that I grew up and I read a lot, right? And I grew up in groups where you were studying groups, right? Like you read all of this stuff, and you may disagree with a particular group's political orientation, if it was that. But there was a lot of reading and studying that took place. People read a lot. Social media encourages short attention span, right? And really superficial engagement with topics and so on, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we need to find ways to sort of neutralize that. But I think social media is with us to stay. It's important. It connects people who wouldn't normally be connected. I can communicate with people across the world and engage in discussions with them. And I just think we have to find more effective ways on the left to get our ideas across, right? And to avoid our kind of superiority attitude as well. We have to be able to persuade people. We have to make our work digestible and understandable to them as we raise their consciousness. It's not like, because it tends to be a superiority attitude sometimes where, I have the analysis, right? Well, where was your analysis where was your position 10, 15, 20 years ago? Were you at this heightened level of consciousness, right? Because we all go through our journeys. It's like I always use the example of Malcolm X, right? If, Malcolm X born in 1926, if I remember correctly, right? So if you interacted with Malcolm when he was 21, 22, he was like, he's not the Malcolm who emerges, right? As Malcolm X, right? And you dismiss him as a hoodlum, right? Yeah. Okay, as a hood, right? Okay, but look at the journey he made, right? Yeah. So I think there's a superiority attitude that people have that I think, that doesn't mean, we accept people's ideas that may be offensive and backward, but we have to find ways of engaging and transforming people's ideas, right?
I love that. I love it. I think one of the things that's interesting to me about it is, and I won't get into this too much, but people have a history, as you said, and they come from a space and they learn and they grow. And the fact that so many people have become maybe embarrassed of the views they once held, and they erase those and they scrub it and they no longer share those and they only want to say the correct thing. It makes it harder for other people who are trapped along the path of the wrong thinking, and they don't see a way out, and they feel like maybe they're the only one. It really becomes us versus them. So we got to be more inclusive.
We don't have discussion, right? Okay, that's an issue. I think we need to create a climate of real discussion, and we don't have that on social media. You don't have a climate of discussion. What you have, and I read a lot of blogs, I read a lot of stuff, and people can be vicious to other people, right? Okay, and I don't know. I mean, like I tend to be a little too self-critical and self-reflective, right? I see people say, like, I was reading a blog and a guy says, obviously you have replying to somebody else, obviously you have an intellectual deficit, right? Okay, yeah. I was like, who says that to somebody, right?
Absolutely,
okay. Yeah. Okay, I mean, like, you engage in a debate, so there's that sort of, it gets very nasty, right? Absolutely. Okay, and it's not conducive, right? So then you go back to Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts. You read, what does it mean to be a human being, right? Okay, this ensemble of social relations dealing with alienation, right? Is social media a means by which people become alienated from their real essence, right? Okay, so are they alienated from other people even though they're interacting with social media? Are they alienated from their essence as well, right? And then the idea comes up, and there's a famous essay by Gorky, I'm trying to remember the name of it, right? But he talks about the contradiction between the I and the we, the I and the collective, right? Okay, and how do we bring, because, one of the things that society needs to do is, my individual project, what I want to do with my life, we have to harmonize that with the collectives and the national project, the international project. How do we do that in a system such as capitalism, which promotes this individualism, right? So even a lot of these people who might consider themselves anti-capitalists and engage in, all sorts of struggles, the way they talk about the struggles is very narcissistic. Okay? It's very narcissistic. It starts from the I and stays at the I. It very rarely, looks at the collective struggles we're part of and so forth. And human beings, are collective beings. The I and the we are interconnected and dialectically interconnected. It doesn't mean human beings, individuals are drops of water in the ocean. No, every drop is important, but we're part of that ocean, right?
Like, just looking at historically how we've leveraged that ocean and what the mechanisms of power and leverage have been, it always is through, it seems, electoralism. And we're coming towards an election here, and I don't want to get too much into electoralism, but with what you've seen out there, is there anybody who kind of gives you hope as opposed to in regard to fighting the imperialist narrative?
Well, I think the question is, in Canada, it's empowering people, right? Okay, these arrangements we have don't work anymore, right? Yeah. Okay, they don't even work for the bourgeoisie, right? Okay, the ruling class, right? Because elections, do two things. It sort of measures the different strengths of the contending forces, and it's how the ruling class works out its contradictions, right? Okay, among its factions, right? Yeah. Elections take place. They select who's going to run. They put the money in, right? We have very little choice in choosing people. We vote for, their choices, and we reduce the voting cattle every 3 or 4 years, right? But there's been a disequilibrium in the system. You see it in the United States, and you see it here in Canada, right? And we're actually having an election here in Nova Scotia, provincial election, right? Yeah. August the 25th, right? So you see all of these things, and one of the things they do is that the people feel disempowered, right? Okay, so it's going to be interesting to see how many people actually vote. Okay, I mean, regardless of the pandemic and so forth, right? It's going to be very interesting to see how many people vote, and so people are disempowered. So I think none of these parties really talk about solutions to the problems we face in a social, economic, and political environment, much less the natural environment, right?
Yeah.
Everything is within the existing structure we have, right? And at the end of the day, they always marginalize the people, right? The political arrangements we have, right? Marginalize people, right? So for example, when it comes to an election, there's all these small parties, right? Okay, that run, right? But it's only so you'll only have maybe 3 or 4 parties, right? Depending who will get on the stage, right? Okay. So in a sense, from the very beginning, it's undemocratic in that sense, right? Okay. I mean, there's some of these small parties I don't agree with, right? At the end of the day, right? But if you're really truly democratic, everybody's voice should be heard, right?
Yeah.
And so on. But and then we don't participate in the 3 so-called major or 4 major parties, even if we count the Green Party and so on. Nobody participates really in selecting. So less than 1% of Canadians, 1 or 2, are members of political parties in Canada, right?
Wow.
One of the figures I saw, right?
That low. Good Lord.
Yeah, it's really low, right? Okay. So you have these people who are selecting the leaders you're going to run to. So where's the role of, so it's not only that you have a right to vote, you should have a right to select, right? And to be elected, right? And I think this is a big issue. People are disempowered, and increasingly, I think the system itself, is not resolving the contradictions and the disequilibria in the system itself, right? Okay. So, we have hung parliament. So we have very close parliaments, and then we have what people call this polarization, right? And this polarization is often artificially created, right? Right? People, doing these polls to pit people against other people's and so on, right? And then, of course, it's taking place under an archaic constitution.
Yeah.
I mean, a constitution, that, basically, of July 1st, the British North American Act of July 1st, 1867, it's false in claim that the 2 founding nations, right? And then this 19th century document is supposed to govern us in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Okay. A document written by, white men of property, right?
Yeah.
Excluding indigenous people, women, people who are property. This is bizarre, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The whole thing's so odd. I'm sorry.
I just made it, and it's interesting. So we have this where it was repatriated in 1982. It had the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it's inviolable like the U.S. Constitution. So we go back to the founding fathers and we read the Federalist Papers, right? And these guys who were slaveholders, right, and so forth, and expanding into indigenous territory in the United States, right? Okay, these are the people who are supposed to guide us in the 21st century, but it's inviolable, right? And we look at this with awe. And when I look at the example of Cuba, I mean, Cuba, when the revolution triumphed, there was when Batista staged the coup in 1952, which was the police state that Fidel Castro rebelled against. He suspended the 1940 constitution. Okay, and the 1940 Cuban constitution was very, very progressive, right? All sorts of stuff around land reform, a whole number of different things, and workers' rights and so on. And that was a constitution that was reinstituted, in Cuba when the revolution triumphed, right? Then in 1976, because conditions had changed in Cuba, right, and so on, they wrote a new constitution, right? And then that constitution was approved in through debates and discussion, and by secret vote in a popular referendum. And then there was various little amendments to that constitution, right, that took place, right, up in 92 and so on. And then we have a new constitution rewritten a few years ago, and then a mass vote, because Cuban society had changed. Cuba in 2021 is not Cuba in 1980 or Cuba in 1970, Cuba in 1960. Canada, it's like, how can we use a document from the 19th century to govern us, right? And also, this is the constitutional order in which our elections take place. And that document was a disempowered people, right? So my whole point getting to the elections is that, I think people are disempowered, and no party really, none of the major parties offers me hope. What I think is people need to find ways to become the decision makers. And that's the big question. How do you become empowered? How do you become the decision makers in society? And that requires new arrangements in society, new political arrangements.
And it's such a hard question. I think we have the best person possible to answer it, because I was going to ask you that next.
Not me. I don't think I have.
I think just taking a look at kind of what we've covered so far, we talked about social media is important to kind of fight back against the imperialist narrative. We talked about how it is important to kind of get out there and not just focus on your pool, but try to build collectively with others and de-atomize yourself as much as possible. I wonder then, what would you say is that next step to kind of de-atomize and find others and work in collectively? Is there specific groups you support, or?
Well, I think, I mean, geez, I'm involved in different groups, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm involved in Canadian Network and Cuba Works on Solidarity. I work in Cuba Solidarity. I work in the Black community and so forth. I think collectives organizing, okay, is a very important, and asserting their rights. I think asserting the fact that we as human beings have rights by the very fact that we're human beings, and collectives have rights. Okay, I think that's critically important, right? And I think that's what the system cannot abide by, right? Okay. I don't, there's this idea to try and divide the polity, right, and to separate the polity, right? Okay, to pit different sections of the polity against the difference against other sections and so forth. So I support all struggles against oppression and exploitation, and all struggles that where people assert their collective and individual rights. Okay, I think that's important. So we have the immigrants, right? We have the issues around nobody's illegal, right? Okay, yeah. Which I think is critically important, because we have this problem where they're bringing in labor from places like Jamaica, where the condition of people need work, they're unemployed, and they're brought here. And then, people are happy to be here working, okay, because they need work to support their families. And basically they have very little labor protection, right? Yeah. And so forth, and they're corralled in these places, right? I think that those struggles I support as well. The Black Lives Matter movement as well. The struggle of particularly the struggle of indigenous peoples for their hereditary and their treaty rights, okay, are critically important, right? And the struggle of all the collectives, right? I think, the issue when people talk a lot about decolonization, and I don't think what people realize what decolonization is, transforming the social relations of this country. That's what it boils down to. They're not, indigenous people aren't talking about driving Europeans out. Okay, they're not talking about that. They're talking about transforming the social relations in this country, right? So that, the forms of exploitation, oppression don't exist, and that the envelope of freedom and creativity for everybody can be expanded, right? And so on. I mean, and nature and the environment can be protected, ecology can be protected, right?
Yeah, that's such an inspiring way to put it. Do you feel like, we initiated the conversation talking about Cuba, and it's kind of gone on more broadly into like this kind of the state of life in Canada. And I'm wondering, do you feel in a way that maybe the best way for Canadians to act in solidarity with Cuba is to take the critical actions like signing the petitions and whatnot, making their voices heard, but then also being active in building socialism within their own community?
Well, I think, the struggle in Canada is within Canada, right? Okay. I think obviously I've mentioned that Canada should be a factor for peace. Okay, so I know people of their movements to get Canada out of NATO. There's a new Canadian Foreign Policy Institute that organized, just formed a little while ago, maybe a year or so ago, and they had a forum bringing together all these different groups. So and other groups have had anti-war groups, right? I've all from CPCML, the CP. There's anti-war groups like No Harbor for War here in Halifax. There's all people have often said, listen, get out of NATO, get out of NORA, right? Those have been positions that have been articulated, right? So I think that's one thing. When it comes to Cuba, right, specifically, I think right now the signing of this petition is very important. Cuba is under attack, okay? United States attempted to get all these nations of the Americas and other nations outside to sign a statement it wrote condemning Cuba. And, it was very important that we have a petition that shows that Canadians, right, regardless of what they think about the political and economic system in Cuba, Canadians realize that Cuba's fate and destiny is to be decided by the Cuban people, not through political interference. So I think that's important. Signing a petition, also supporting the Cuban medical supplies campaign, right? Okay, because the United States and this, what the United States is doing is asphyxiating Cuba. It's right in their documents. They make it very clear. So you have Lester Mallory in his April 6, 1960 thing, talking about hunger and desperation, okay, to create those conditions to starve the Cuban economy. And you have people like, people talking like senators, we're going to make the economy scream. We have, for example, members of the previous Trump government regime or administration, whatever term you want to use, talking about financially asphyxiating Cuba, strangling Cuba. We have people in the Biden administration talking about cutting off their lifeblood, right? So these are terms, it's an intent, and in fact, it's genocidal, right? Yeah. Okay, why do I say it's genocidal? Well, if anybody reads the Convention on Genocide, right, 1948, it talks about one of the things is the intent to cause harm in part to whole or in a part of a people, right? And so it's documented by the United Nations. For example, for 29 consecutive times, United Nations has voted overwhelmingly in support of Cuba. The last vote this June 23rd was 184-2. Only the United States and Israel stood with the U.S. economic war against Cuba. We have Oxfam did a fantastic report. We have all sorts of reports showing how the U.S. war against Cuba harms the Cuban people, right? Okay, so that's genocidal, right? And it's attempts to cut Cuba off from trading with other countries. So, for example, what the United States will do if a company in a country is going to engage in business with Cuba, the United States will go, the embassy will go and say, listen, well, you can trade with Cuba, but we'll deny you access to the market, right? Yeah. So I'll give you an example, okay? And of course, there are things like if this is truly bizarre, if a company in a country that's not the United States, like Canada or Britain, is going to trade with Cuba, okay, the goods they're trading with Cuba must have less than 10% of US components in it. Wow. If we were to send medicines to Cuba now, okay, because the United States has made it extremely difficult for Cuba to get medicines because US dominates the pharmaceutical business, okay, and so US economic sanctions on getting medicines to Cuba apply. And in fact, what people don't realize is until the pandemic, Cuba produced 83% of all of its medicines, but the pandemic and US sanctions has made it very difficult for them to get the inputs to produce it, right? Yeah. So if we were to send medicines from Canada to Cuba, buy them cheaply in Canada and send them to Cuba, if they had 10% and more US components or manufacturing involved with them, we couldn't send them, and those companies could be fined, right? So, for example, we have banks like in Switzerland, UBS, which is a big bank in Switzerland, was fined over $100 million for allowing the Cubans to keep bank accounts there, right, in US dollars, right? Okay, and that's why, because why do these banks cave into these fines? Well, it's because the SWIFT system, when you're transferring money from one bank account to another, the SWIFT system, predominantly is very deeply influenced by the United States, right? It's controlled. I think it comes out of the IMF, right? Controlled by the IMF, and it's controlled, right? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there's an issue. So the U.S. is attempting to cut Cuba's trade links, its sources of finance and capital off from the rest of the world. It's incredibly profound. A ship that docks in a Cuban port cannot dock in a U.S. port for over 6 months. So you can imagine how that makes transportation costs that's much more expensive for Cuba, because they have to compensate these transport lines for the fact they won't have access to Cuban to the U.S. ports as well, right? They cut up medicines, right? Access to medical equipment and so forth, fuel, all of these different things as well, right? So what I think is important is signing this petition, supporting our medical supplies campaign. We have 2 million syringes, I've mentioned before, going to Cuba. We're sending medical supplies regularly to Cuba to help them because they've had a flare-up of the COVID pandemic, as we see elsewhere taking place in the world, and to perhaps write letters to the MPs. No, I don't have faith in this parliamentary system, but I'm part of a solidarity movement, right? And people have faith in it, right? And with the petition and with the parliamentary thing, we're using it to demonstrate that there is such a solid support for Cuba that perhaps it would make the government think twice about the public outrage that would happen if it decided to mirror US policy towards Cuba. Another thing is, when the pandemic is over, to travel to Cuba, not only to be tourists, so you can, because Cuba depends on it, okay, tourism is a big part of the economy, but also to travel to Cuba and witness Cuban reality for itself, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why Trump closed off the U.S. travel to Cuba. So when Obama on December 17, 2014, announced the formalization of diplomatic relations with Cuba, okay, he opened up a bunch of travel to Cuba, right? Americans were traveling 250,000 at least a year, right? And they were coming back completely disabused of the propaganda against Cuba. Not thinking Cuba is not a utopia. Nobody's pretending it's a utopia, but they'll come back realizing what the society is doing, right? No homelessness population in Cuba, right? All the children are educated, right? Okay. One of the safest countries in Latin America, right? And so they were coming back saying, and a country that where the idea is that it's militarized and it's gray. Okay, and there's a police officer and an army tank on every corner. Furthest from the truth, right? So they were being deeply influenced. So what happened was Obama's plan, and I think the plan was that, well, we can contaminate them with the superior ideas of capitalism in our society when we send Americans there, right? But Americans were being transformed transformed by the experience in Cuba, right? Okay, so one of the things Canadians can do is travel to Cuba and witness Cuban reality for themselves, but also struggle here within Canada, right? Okay, we need to transform Canada. We need to ensure that Canada is not part of these predatory military blocs, that Canada doesn't participate in these wars, right? Okay, because these aren't going to be local wars. If the U.S. really does engage in a contestation with China, right? I mean, it's going to be catastrophic for the world, for the environment, for the world economy, and for the future of our students, right? And the point you made, is it possible for Canada to be an authentic and genuine factor for peace if it's not a socialist Canada? I mean, that's a debate people can have, right? But I think by struggling for a more just Canada, will be reflected in a better foreign policy of Canada at the same time. I think these struggles are dialectically linked.
Thank you so much for taking the time to tune into our conversation on Cuba. Dr. Saney, absolutely incredible. We do have another half hour coming up with him where he talks about his upcoming book, which sounds incredibly fascinating. It talks about the historical relationship with Cuba and Africa and how it's linked to today. So be sure to check that out. If you want to get more involved or just take a look at the organization he works with, which is the Canadian Network on Cuba, I would check out CanadianNetworkOnCuba.ca. They have two actions they're asking for support on. One, a petition that's being supported by Nikki Ashton. This is calling on the United States government to end all economic sanctions against Cuba. And two, they have a medical supplies campaign for Cubans who are in desperate need of support amid COVID. One, you can go to their website, which is CanadianNetworkOnCuba.ca, and click the links to get information there. Or you can just send an email to donate@CanadianNetworkOnCuba.ca